So I'm guessing you're broadly familiar with the idea that the music industry can really exploit artists in awful ways. But the thing is, this has quite often affected black artists way, way worse. Today on the show, a new documentary dives into how some of the biggest artists of all time have been exploited. I'm Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud. This is Commotion. Look, I want to talk about this new three-part documentary. It is a joint collaboration from the CBC and the BBC, and also the actor Idris Elba, you know, my twin. We'll talk about that later. It's called Paid in Full, The Battle for Black Music. And as that title hints, it is a documentary that deals with the exploitation that black artists have experienced in the music industry, particularly in the US. Let me just play you this first.
We have generation after generation of us not seeing a fair piece of the pie.
They're making more money than they have ever made in the history of the music business.
For over a century, black artists have been exploited by the recording industry. This is the story of how some survived and fought back.
They're making more money than they've ever made in the music industry. That is a taste of Paid in Full, The Battle for Black Music. Rolly Pemberton, a.k.a. Cadence Weapon, is a musician and writer. MK Asante is a culture critic. They're both in the documentary, and they're both right here with me. MK, Rolly, welcome to the show, y'all. How's it going?
Peace. How you doing? Thanks for having
how you
me,
doing,
brother.
man?
I'm delighted that you guys are both here. I'm delighted to get into this. MK, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. I think people sort of intuitively get this idea that there's exploitation in the music industry. They sort of get that, and that black artists have maybe borne the brunt of that. How do you think this new documentary maybe deepens our understanding of that dynamic?
Yeah, because thanks for having me again. Thanks for having us as a guest. I think it's a great question. I think sometimes people don't really understand the extent and how pervasive and how foundational all of that exploitation is to the existence of what we have now. So I think, we may hear certain things about, structural racism and systemic racism, but we don't always understand how they work, what was actually done, what's the actual history. And I think what we do in this three-part documentary series, which I'm honored to be in, and I'm honored to have worked on this documentary with this elaborate, great crew from CBC to BBC to Idris's company. From the beginning, as this was conceived, we came in and we wanted to tell a story that wasn't told before. We wanted to be a voice for the voiceless. We wanted to, talk about something that people were afraid to talk about and really dive into it so that people don't just have talking points, but they understand what was the exploitation? How did it work? How did it function? And how was it passed on for generations?
Yeah, I think the idea that you sort of take this notion, this broad and maybe amorphous notion of like, hey, there's exploitation, and go, no, this is how it operates. This is how it operates, in this industry, and get a little closer to the heart of it. Cadence, you're a black artist yourself. How aware were you of this idea of being exploited by the industry when you were starting your career?
I was very aware.
Go off.
The famous Tribe Called Quest lyric, industry rule number 4080, record company people are shady. That's really a foundational text for me.
Sure.
And, you hear all the stories, like Chuck Berry with his publishing on the song Maybelline randomly being given to DJ Alan Freed and some person who gave the label a loan. It's just the music industry is inherently exploitative and extractive, and it's exacerbated when it comes to black artists.
So I want to talk about some of the heartbreaking stories that come up in the documentary. One of them revolves around one of the greatest of all time, Louis Armstrong, right? Who many people would know, of course, for What a Wonderful World. MK, can you briefly just tell us how one of the greats went to his grave, fully kind of betrayed?
Yeah, well, we talk about lots of different stories in Paid in Full. We want to highlight certain figures, and one of those figures that we highlight is the great Louis Armstrong, who was responsible for so much important music in our culture and our world.
Yeah.
But when he was starting out, he was told, that he needed to have essentially a white person to protect him and also to negotiate for him, right? So that he would be in a better position to navigate the industry if he had a white person who essentially he was their N-word, right? So what he did was he found this guy named Joe Glazier who seemed to he had connections with organized crime, and Joe said, "I will protect you. I will negotiate for you." But what Joe did was, which is industry rule number 48. So what Joe did, of course, was kept two sets of books, exploited beyond belief, stole. Not only kept two sets of books, but he would tell an artist, for example, famously, "Oh, you're getting $500 to do this show." Meanwhile, the artist is really getting $10,000 or $5,000 to do the show,
Wow.
and Joe's keeping all that money. And so when Joe was on his deathbed, Joe was selling Louis Armstrong's catalog and his likeness while he was on his deathbed, and so Louis had to visit him and said, "Man, I'm gonna bury you." It got very very tense, and Louis died only a couple years later, but he was so bitter and angry, as you can imagine, from that experience, and so that's one of the stories that we tell in this piece.
Yeah, like heartbreaking doesn't even begin to describe it, right? It's infuriating.
Not even close.
You see, Rolly, I see you sort of shaking your head as MK was sort of telling that story. There is another story that the doc gets to, and it's when TLC drops this gigantic piece of news at the 1996 Grammy Awards.
We are the biggest selling female group ever. 10 million albums worldwide. We have worked very hard. We have been in this business for 5 years, and we are broke as broke can be, and we're not happy at all.
The idea that you could be one of the biggest selling artists on the planet at the time, and then you have to get on a stage at the Grammys and say, "I don't have money. I don't have money because of the ways that this system's been implemented, rob me of that money." That is TLC, arguably at their peak of their success in 1996. Each with a Grammy in their hand as they sort of say this, making this admission that rocked fans, that rocked the music industry. MK, in a nutshell, how did TLC end up being exploited in this particular case?
Yeah, well, TLC is one of the biggest examples that we talk about in this documentary, in this three-part documentary. And what we wanted to do was talk about examples from the past, but also how these examples affect people in a contemporary sense. And that's why, when we established the things that happened early on in the music industry, all of those things become learned behaviors and become precedents. So what happens is, as you go into the 20th century, you have in the 21st century, you have more companies essentially following those models, but not just following those models, improving on those models and forcing artists, getting artists to sign contracts. And that's been a big part of this this story, is having artists sign contracts that are not benefiting them. In fact, having artists sign contracts and having artists have counsel that the label has. So the label is providing counsel for the artist. You don't have to get your own lawyer. You can use our lawyer.
Rolly, tell me about that moment, that TLC moment. How big of a deal was that for you as you were growing up?
That was definitely a watershed moment. It was one of the first times that we've seen a big mainstream artist come out and be like, this system is not working for me, and it's not the way it seems. I think with a lot of artists and fans, you see what you see in the music videos. You see when they're on stage, and it's like they must be doing great. They're these big stars, but behind the scenes, you don't know what these deals that they're signing actually are. And I think just as an artist, too, my experience, you can have a deal in front of you and you can have a lawyer look at it, and sometimes you're in a position where you feel like you don't have the leverage.
Yeah.
Where it's this thing where it's like, well, maybe this is my only chance.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think I want to talk about that gap, because there's something about this story that I don't think always penetrates to the empathy of people who are listening. And I think it's a thing that you just said, Rolly. It's this idea of people are watching the music videos and people are watching the red carpets and people are watching you know, like get all dressed up to go to an award show. And like MK, to me, like we are used to hearing artists brag. I think we're used to hearing artists brag about a Billboard achievement. We're used to hearing them brag about, you know, a major sales accomplishment. And that's great. But there is, I think, pressure to project this air of success sometimes as an artist. How do you think that has undermined the audience's ability to understand or even have sympathy for the exploitation that these artists maybe face? That was
I think those shiny things. Yeah, those shiny things that you mentioned were always actually a part of the strategy that record companies use to lure in you know, Black artists. When I say part of the strategy, I mean this is a predatory practice, you know, that's been going on, and it's happened all over the world. It's happening on the continent of Africa as well. But in terms of this particular practice, you have labels preying on people in poverty, preying on people in desperate situations. Rolly said, you know, maybe this is the best deal I can get, right? And, you know, people preying on that opportunity to take advantage of someone who may feel that they're in a situation where this might be the best they can get, knowing that if you really knew your value, you would know that that's not the best you can get. You can do better, but their job is to make you feel like you don't have value without them. And so that's one of the things that we see. And I think the artists, you know, there's an enthusiasm, there's an excitement about, you know, there used to be, I think there's been a shift, but there used to be an excitement about getting a deal, you know, it's a celebratory thing, right? You know, I think now artists are more, what we talk about in the documentary as well is the new school of thought is celebrating independence, celebrating intellectual freedom. You know, I think that's where we've gone in terms of our thinking. But I think historically we've always been celebrating, first of all, our own achievements, our own recognition of our music, and our ability to reach a larger audience. You know, it's not celebrating the fact that, so I think that's been the celebration. I think the record labels, I mean, they used to just give people cars instead of money. You know what I mean? Here's a Cadillac, you know, and you know, and that may appease someone for a moment, right? Especially without the proper education and support system around them. But eventually, we had to, you know, things had to change, and that's what one of the things we talk about is that change as well. That's why we interview people like Master P as well. And
I was going to say that, like, the idea of celebrating independence, like we're sitting with Rolly at this table, you know what I mean? I feel like Rolly, like that's been a fundamental part of your posture in this industry. I got maybe like a minute left here, but I just want to give you a last word on this, which is the idea like this whole documentary opens with this disclaimer that states all major labels were approached to participate in this series, but they declined to be interviewed. What do you make of that reaction?
Well, I'm like, why would they want to tell on themselves? You know, they're, you know, they are the problem, really. Like this industry is inherently exploitative. And I think one of the most important things we can do as artists is, you know, to stop this projecting, oh, we're so rich, we're so successful, especially in rap music.
Especially when it's fake too, right, Rolly?
Yeah, exactly. And it's
99% of the time. Yeah,
it's a self-fulfilling situation where it's like everyone, it's like, oh, I can't admit that I'm struggling, so then we have to act a certain way. I think we need to stop that.
I think that is go ahead, MK.
I just wanted to make the connection between, you know, the Diddy situation that's going on right now and this, you know, we're talking about exploitation, right, of people, whether we're talking about Black exploiters, white exploiters, historically, you know, we're talking about exploitation. We're talking about a racist system that has been exploiting Black people for a long time, that, as Frantz Fanon said in Black Skin, White Mask, the colonized will adapt the same, you know, methods as the colonizer and continuum. And so I want to make the connection that this documentary series is an indictment, really. You know, when you think about that word, we knew what people said. They knew what Diddy was doing. They heard about it. They heard this. They heard that. Just like you asked me in the beginning, what does this documentary really do? Well, we heard about, oh yeah, TLC. You heard about Chuck Berry. You heard about Nina Simone. You heard about Louis Armstrong. You heard, oh yeah, black people get exploited in the industry. This is the indictment that lays it all out, right? This is the case that lays it all out and ultimately makes it, how do you repair this? How do you fix this, right? Where are we going with this? And one of the arguments many of the artists make is that reparations in the music industry needs to happen. I mean, we talk about these artists historically, their families are still suffering. The legacy of this, it hasn't gone away.
I think that's actually a good place to leave it, because I want people to watch this documentary and then come back and sort of have this conversation more fully. The documentary is just about to be out here in Canada. MK and Rolly, I appreciate you guys being here. I don't think we're done with this conversation, so I'm going to check in with you in just a bit. Thank you again for being here.
All right, peace.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, y'all. Really appreciate it. Rolly Pemberton is a rapper known as Cadence Weapon. He's starting a new residency. You can get more details about it from cadenceweapon.substack.com. And MK Asante is an author, filmmaker, and academic. His latest book is called Nephew, a memoir in 4-part harmony, and it's out now. And you can watch that docuseries, Paid in Full, The Battle for Black Music, this Saturday on CBC Gem. I'm Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud. This is Commotion. Look, we've been seeing this trend lately, and it just happened at the VMAs, where the red carpet looks that people actually talked about are the ones where stars channeled other celebrities. Maybe you saw Sabrina Carpenter wearing this vintage dress that Madonna wore to the Oscars in the 90s, or maybe you saw Tate McRae recreating this famous Britney Spears outfit from maybe 20 years ago, I think, the sheer black dress situation. It's a lot of deja vu around here right now, and it is kind of serving an interesting purpose. Joan Summers is here. She wrote about the trend of archival fashion on the red carpet for Paper Magazine. Joan, welcome to the show. How's it going?
It's going so well. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so happy that you're here, because I can't stop thinking about this. Okay, tell me, what did you see when you saw the VMAs red carpet this year?
Okay, so I immediately picked out the Bob Mackie dress, the famous Madonna Bob Mackie dress that Sabrina Carpenter wore.
Yeah.
I also saw Elizabeth Hurley's Gianni Versace dress. That was, I believe, Gianni Versace 1996 that Halsey picked up as well. And then also, you know, we had Britney in the I'm a Slave for You look with the snake. And then, like you just mentioned, Tate McRae and the Roberto Cavalli.
Yeah.
I believe it was the 2001 VMAs that Britney wore that sort of lacy little look. And I think Glorilla also did TLC. Lisa Left Eye did the TLC look also with the braids as well. That's quite famous. So, you know, it was just like one hit after another. I saw it was almost like I stepped into a time machine, or I was experiencing, like you said, some sort of deja vu.
Joan, first of all, what a fun party trick it is to sort of be watching the VMAs and be like, I believe that Britney Spears wore this in 2001. Because, like, that's a special kind of brain, and I love to see it. Okay, tell me about why. Why are we seeing so many archival fashion pieces sort of show up on the red carpet right now?
Yeah, so I think that, like, I point this out in my blog a little bit, but I also have written about this quite extensively, that we live in a very visual culture right now. You know, we have TikTok and Instagram are sort of the main commodities for pop culture journalism, pop culture itself, the way that we experience it. And I think that we also live in a culture that is very scared of trying something new, and as such leans a lot on nostalgia. You know, we know what worked. We know what worked 20 years ago. We know what worked even 10 years ago. We're seeing TV shows that got off the air a few seasons ago getting rebooted with sort of this big nostalgia packaging by major networks. And in the music industry too, we see a lot of interpolation, as they call it these days, or sampling, as we probably would have called it when I started out in music. But no, I think that we live in a culture that is very afraid. I think studios, I think stylists, I think designers are afraid that people are not going to buy something that they've never had to wear before. And we also have a culture that is trading in sort of this visual currency of, like, you know, being able to pull an archival look and be like, oh, wait, yes, I know that. Linda Evangelista wore that for Chanel and yada, yada, yada. You know, there is something to be written about there. There's a headline there. There's an easy grab there for Instagram or TikTok. Yeah. And so I think that we see it more and more now, just as our culture sort of trends that way, I think.
But can I tell you why I'm obsessed with this story? I'm obsessed with this
Please, yeah.
story because to me, it's a part of the conversation about how we don't have new movie stars anymore and we don't have
Absolutely.
new music stars anymore. It's like we used to be able to deliver a celebrity. Like you used to be able to like launch a person and go, this is their visual identity. This is their visual. This is like how you recognize their general brand and style and vibe. And as we've gotten more and more effective to reach people, like it's incredible how many people TikTok can reach, for example, we've gotten a little bit worse at developing new visual identities. And it feels like everybody's just trying to do the thing where they go, well, when they used to reach people and launch real stars, this is what they did. So we should just do that. And it kind of feels like this mass cultural stagnation that is, frankly, at this point, a little annoying. Am I wrong to be annoyed by this? Does that register for you?
Yeah, no, it does feel annoying. It feels sometimes like, you know, we have these, especially I want to say so many like women and Black women specifically that have created these like iconic red carpet looks, iconic fashion looks, or even in music, the way that rap women in the 90s like set the visual language so much. And then you have, sometimes I think it can feel like a new generation comes in and are like, wait, I don't have to do my own thing. I can just sort of cheat off of someone else's homework. And I also think that it shows more than anything like a labor problem in these industries where we used to have, especially in music industries, we see now how there was exploitation and abuse happening, of course. But there also used to be a lot of money put into pop stars in a way that is not happening these days when people get sort of cherry picked off of Instagram or TikTok, more so TikTok, because they can pop visually, you know, they come with 1 million followers.
Yeah.
I think that like back then it was like they were putting the girls through boot camps, you know, they had Matthew Knowles. Again, we all have the opinions about Matthew that we have, but Beyonce was running and singing, the classic story, you know? So I think that overall it also just reads like there's less work being put into it. And I think that maybe there is some to blame for these stars, you know, sort of jumping to the front of the line, it feels like, because of this new internet culture we have. But I also think the real villain here is these studios and stylists and designers that are like, oh, we don't have to craft an identity for these people. We can just pull from Madonna. We can pull from these people. And it's funny going back to someone like Lady Gaga, who 10 years ago was at the center of so many Madonna controversies, now being sort of the visual language for a lot of these stars. It's like, oh God, I don't think anyone back then knew what we were really in for in a decade.
Well, that's what's kind of wild about this is like, I understand wanting to put Tate McRae, you know, in contrast to Britney, but I'm not buying it. Like, there's no universe in which I'm going to think about Tate McRae as a new generational Britney. There's no way I'm going to think about Sydney Sweeney as a new generation Angelina Jolie, which is like she sort of wore a dress that references an Angelina Jolie look from the early 2000s as well. And so it feels like you're trying to skip a few steps in order to sell me on an idea that I'm like, I'm not buying it. Like, none of this is actually working. And you know what I love is like an exception that proves the rule. And so like the exception is Chappell Roan. Chappell is doing looks that are like, that's wild. I don't know what you're doing, but I'm sort of obsessed with it. And it is actually like your own sort of distinct visual identity. But what I'm curious about is like, do we have anyone else? Do we have anyone else that's like, it actually is kind of working. You have your own visual language. You don't need to reach back and convince me, oh, you're Jennifer Love Hewitt from The Tuxedo. Like, you know, like who who's doing it? And I know, it was the first one that came to mind.
No, I love that. No, okay, so I want to give shout out to Tyla, who wore Area Couture, and it was like a look that wasn't necessarily groundbreaking for the VMAs, but it was sort of in line with this identity that Tyla has crafted. And I think it goes hand in hand also, like giving props to Tyla, an artist that has truly like blazed a trail for South African music specifically, and, you know, made even a point at the VMAs to shout out the fact that like was nominated for Afrobeats and makes more so Amapiano music or music in the South African tradition, not the Afrobeats tradition, and had to be like, I won this award. It's not really what I'm doing. Let me shout out the people that actually do this. And I think that there are artists like that where, you know, I look at Tyla and it makes me feel the way that probably people a few years older than me who weren't just like in elementary school buying Destiny's Child stuff probably felt about Beyonce, where they were like, oh, a lot of people hated at the time, but I think real ones were like, oh, she's going to change the world. I sort of
love
feel
that.
like that about Tyla right now. But I also want to shout out, you know, she's gotten a lot of hate on the internet, but Addison Rae wore Miss Claire Sullivan and was sort of paying homage to Madonna. But if you compare the looks, it's sort of a cone-ish bra, but the looks are completely separate. Like,
Joan, I got to stop you there because I'm actually literally out of time. I can't believe we're ending on an Addison Rae note, but I love to see it. Thank you for being here. This has been a great conversation. Thank you for your time. My name is Elamin Abdul Mahmoud. This show is called Commotion. Hey, we are going to be back tomorrow. We will see you then.